Every professional card player knows when their cards are worthless and when to heed the chorus in Kenny Rogers' song, The Gambler. You got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, and know when to run. If you look at the last battles on German soil as a military historian, and then when you look into the faces of the responsible generals, you keep wondering what must have been going on in their minds. That as soldiers general staff trained, they didn't even follow the simplest rules a gambler follows, where the only thing at stake is money. For that, the trained soldiers in a war that was long lost should have known better. In Breslau, too, senseless orders from the Führer were carried out, which cost tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides their lives and hundreds of thousands their health. Older officers with golden rank insignia often quietly submitted to the Reich Defense Commissioners, who, as Gauleiters, held absolute power after July 20th, 1944, until everything was destroyed. Rather than surrender, those with golden rank insignia, mostly older, kept going. I am not aware of any German general who was executed by Hitler for exceeding orders or alleged cowardice. As happened a few hundred times in the Soviet Union, especially during the devastating defeats for the Red Army in the summer of 1941. So, on October 28, by personal order of the head of the Soviet Union's secret services from 1938 to 1953, the Georgian Lavrenti Beria, 20 men were summarily executed, including 2 colonel generals and 4 lieutenant generals, and so on. In November 1941, Beria then obtained a simplification of the procedure from Stalin for carrying out death sentences by local military courts. From now on, the Special Council of the NKVD decided matters of life and death, as on the 29th. On January 29, 1942, when 46 people, including 17 generals alone, were sentenced to death, and on the day of the Red Army, the 23rd February, after Stalin's explicit approval, were executed. Here, Stalin writes across Beria's proposed list of names, "Shoot everyone mentioned on the list." JST. So, while the Soviet dictator Stalin had dozens of his military leaders summarily executed because they had disobeyed his not one step back order, German commanders who defied Hitler were at most transferred to the so-called Führer Reserve, which was the reserve of temporarily unassigned officers established within the army. Or they were dismissed from the Wehrmacht while still receiving their salary or pension. After all, as reported by Major General Hans von Alphen, who was appointed as Breslau's combat commander on February 2, 1945, he had clashed so much with the constantly interfering Gauleiter of Lower Silesia and NSDAP Reich Defense Commissioner Karl Hanke that Hanke managed to have him replaced by Hitler. And this, even though von Alphen had explicitly announced Hitler's will in his daily order of February 80. Anyone who abandons their position on their own authority and retreats will be sentenced to death by a summary court for cowardice. Every leader, regardless of unit, not only has the right, but also the duty to enforce discipline against shirkers who abandon their position by all means, including the use of weapons if necessary. And on the 17th of the month, he also threatened civilians with the death penalty if they provided shelter or food to individual soldiers. As for von Alphen's replacement, who after the war wrote, among other things, a thick book about the war in Silesia. However, there are sources that attribute his replacement by the commander of Army Group Center, Colonel General Schörner, to what he saw as Alphen's softness in dealing with Gauleiter Hanke. who, as commander of the Lower Silesian Volkssturm, repeatedly interfered in military planning without von Alphen hurting him, yet still effectively reining him in. In any case, von Alphen was relieved of his duties on March 7 by the 1st. Hermann Niehoff, who was promoted to General of the Infantry on April 1, under whom Breslau's defenses were indeed tightened noticeably. The downside was that this force, made up of exhausted and mostly hastily assembled units, held out until the surrender of Breslau on the 6th. May 1945 had to fight and die on Niehoff's orders. After the general returned from Soviet captivity to the Federal Republic at the end of '55, he lived in Riegsee, Bavaria, until his death at the age of 83, in the district of Garmisch-Partenkirchen. I can't help but, not only in the case of Breslau, accuse the military leadership of continuing to go along, especially after the failed coup attempt of the 20th July 1944, of having become largely complicit in the terrible losses and the unprecedented destruction of German cities in the months that followed until the end of the war. Speaking of July 20th, before I now devote myself to more details of the Battle of Breslau, please allow me to make a digression, which at first glance may seem to have nothing to do with Breslau, but on second glance it certainly does. Because I did not choose the title, Why Breslau Also Had to Die in 1945, for nothing. Here is my, admittedly speculative, answer to that. If the assassination attempt on July 20 had been successful, there would have been a good chance that Breslau, 70% destroyed, could still show its old splendor today, even though much in Breslau was also restored by the Poles, and that much suffering would have been spared the peoples of Europe. But after U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill in January '43 demanded Germany's unconditional surrender at the 1943 Casablanca Conference in Morocco, was the operation's success, for the circle around Colonel Klaus Graf von Stauffenberg, doomed from the very beginning for psychological reasons? Because after the Roosevelt-Churchill demand, also to appease Stalin, a whole series of top German officers had renounced the resistance, because they saw better and more clearly than people in Washington and London could or wanted to see at the time, that through an unconditional surrender of Germany, the Soviet Union would advance deep into the heart of Europe. A strong advocate of the demand for unconditional surrender was Roosevelt here on the 11th December 1941, during the signing of the declaration of war against Germany, which had previously declared war on the USA. His ancestors, von Rosenfeld, had come from the Netherlands to New Amsterdam between 1638 and 1649, which has been called New York since 1664. As for the lifelong negative image of Germany that shaped him, this was the case for the millionaire's son, born in 1882, and otherwise he was taught at home by private tutors. It arose during a 3-month spa stay of his parents in 1891 in the elegant Hessian town of Bad Nauheim, where the 9-year-old attended the local elementary school for 6 weeks. However, I assume that the negative image of Germany was actually awakened and fueled more by his openly anti-German father, James Roosevelt I. In 1913, Franklin, who had since been trained as a lawyer, served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the administration of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson of the Democratic Party, continuing in this role throughout the First World War, which began in 1914. Wilson is well known for his 14 points announced in 1917, which were believed by naive German politicians but later not upheld, promising a just peace and a future world without wars. From August 1921, Roosevelt was gradually paralyzed by an illness to the point that he eventually ended up in a wheelchair. However, his illness had been kept secret from the public for many years. He then won the 1933 presidential election against the Republican incumbent Hoover. He held the office until his death on the 12th. He served until April 1945, and to this day, he is the only U.S. president who served 3 terms, even though the Constitution limits the term to 2. Anyway, Roosevelt's almost unconditional friendship with Stalin also led, among other things, to the demand for unconditional surrender. Anyway, when someone who knew history better than Roosevelt occasionally pointed out Stalin's lust for power to him, Roosevelt replied to him, "I have the feeling that Stalin is not that kind of man. I think that if I give him everything I can and ask for nothing in return, he, noblesse oblige, will not try to annex anything else and will work with me for a world of democracy and peace." It's well known that some high-ranking German officers, after the demands from Casablanca became known, repeatedly asked the Western Allies to pay their price for their participation in overthrowing Hitler, in the form of giving up the demand for unconditional surrender in the East, and, as they argued, the then still intact German Eastern Front in the overall European interest, to be able to hold it better. But their demand was met with sharp rejection by all the Western Allies. These generals may have been wrong time and again in their, to us today, unimaginable loyalty to Hitler, but in this case, they were proven right. Nevertheless, it is a fact that the Western powers had no interest whatsoever in supporting the German resistance in any way, and they even went so far as to generally doubt the existence of a German opposition because what could not be, must not be. But of course, Germany's wartime enemies cannot be blamed for the fact that the attempted coup in July 1944 failed after just a few hours, just as they cannot be blamed for generally wrong German behavior, since they did what they thought was best for their peoples from an official standpoint. This also applies to Roosevelt, who, in addition to his strong affinity for the Soviet Union, which he described as another kind of democracy, despite all contrary statements from the White House, was also in very poor health. And because of his numerous extramarital affairs, he had in fact been abandoned by his wife Eleanor early on. When I now come to the siege and Battle of Breslau, I've already discussed it in my video about the battle. In the course of the Soviet Lower Silesian operation, I briefly addressed the fate of the Lower Silesian capital, which the Poles have called Wartschlag since 1945. Because around the end of February, beginning of March 1945, the top leadership wanted to put their plan into action, which was that, about 130 kilometers east of Lauban since the 13th. Breslau, which had been encircled since February 13th and declared a fortress, was to be liberated. But for this, Lauban had to be recaptured for various reasons. However, Soviet counterattacks and the rapidly decreasing German combat strength prevented that. After that, Breslau, similar to the earlier battles of Stalingrad at the turn of 42 to 43, saw a merciless street and house-to-house combat, which brought death to tens of thousands of civilians, in addition to the thousands killed on both sides. It all began on the 25th. July 44, just 5 days after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler, when he declared Breslau, which had been predominantly German for about 700 years, a fortress, and the Gauleiter of Lower Silesia since 1941 and Reich Defense Commissioner Karl Henke had received the order to defend the city at all costs. This meant the city, located about 350 kilometers southeast of Berlin, was supposed to act as a kind of breakwater, holding up any possible advance of the Red Army toward the Reich capital for as long as possible. Then, under the coordination of, starting from the 25th September, Major General Johannes Krause, who came from the artillery and was appointed fortress commander, found a completely unprepared city, and under his coordination, the fortification work began. Bunkers were built, and livestock was driven into the city to supply the population. From a military perspective, the city itself was ideally situated, because as early as the 13th century, most recently in the years 1850-1890 to 1914, a belt of fortifications had been built around Breslau. In addition, the city was surrounded by tank-unfriendly canals and marshes, shown in blue. Fortifications had also been built away from Breslau, intended to protect the city from artillery fire. But in reality, of course, in the 20th century, no matter how fortified, a city was no longer a fortress, which was also true for the capital of Lower Silesia. Apart from a few Soviet air raids in October 44, Breslau was, at the beginning of 45 alongside Dresden, the only major German city that was still largely intact. And arrogantly, on January 15th, Gauleiter Hanke boasted about the future of Breslau. "The Russians will never take the city. I would rather burn it down." When, on January 12th, the Red Army broke through the German lines in their Vistula Oder operation, with Breslau encircled in red, Gauleiter Hanke, on January 20th, handed over sole command authority to General Krause in his bunker, and then, far too late for an orderly process, ordered the immediate evacuation of women and children by rail transport. However, at that time, Breslau was already overcrowded with tens of thousands of refugees from the east, so that the operations at the main train station and the Freiburger Bahnhof collapsed within a very short time. And in the panic, children and the elderly were trampled to death. Hanke then, on the 26th, ordered the march out of the city in a southwesterly direction, which, due to the freezing temperatures and snow, led to thousands of deaths, mainly among small children and the elderly. When this tragedy became known in the city, many of those ordered to evacuate refused to leave the city, which still had 200,000 people and 40,000 soldiers, the rest being civilians. In this unimaginable chaos, tank trenches and barricades were built, with thousands of civilians also being used for digging and fortification work. Squares and streets were abandoned or turned into strongpoints, and by demolishing entire rows of houses, fields of fire were created. Even a swath near Kaiserstrasse had been blown up, including the Martin Luther Church, for an alternative aircraft takeoff and landing strip 1,300 meters long and 300 meters wide, which, however, was never used. Major General Krause had set up his command post in the casemates of the Belvedere, Liebigshöhe, until 1807, part of the Breslau city fortifications, and called the Taschenbastion, at the site where, since 1936, a monument commemorated the Germans who fell in the former colonies, which, however, like around 70 other German monuments in Breslau, was destroyed by the Poles in 1945. In addition to the civilian hospitals, there were field hospitals, for example, under the main train station and Stiegauer Square. When General Krause then fell ill, he was on the 2nd. On February 2nd, 1945, he was replaced by the already mentioned Major General von Alphen, who came from the Engineering Corps and, as one of his first measures, ordered the demolition of 40 of the 66 bridges in and around Breslau. The higher command authority was Army Group Center under Colonel General Ferdinand Schörner, who as late as the 5th was appointed the last German field marshal on April 5, 1945. The units deployed in Breslau were commanded by the 17th Army, first under General of the Infantry Friedrich Schulz, then under General of the Infantry Wilhelm Hasse. The units just mentioned, with a strength of up to 40,000 men, including the Army Fortress Grenadiers named after their commanders, Army Fortress Grenadier Regiments Sauer, Hanf, and Mohr, here Lieutenant Colonel Mohr awarding soldiers, were often mixed with training units, police companies, officer cadets, and non-commissioned officer training courses, driving schools, convalescent companies, soldiers picked up by the field military police, who were then assembled into emergency units, but also able-bodied male civilians. So, all in all, the picture of a defeated army nearing its end. As was also true of just like the Division ZBV 609, formed on January 26, 1945, which consisted of 4 regiments named after their commanders, Regiments Rheinkober, Kersten, Schulz, and Seibold. The commander of the 609th was General Siegfried Ruff, who, along with other generals, was sentenced to death in Soviet captivity in Riga, and on the 3rd of February 1946 was hanged in Riga. In addition, there were a total of 38 Volkssturm battalions under SA Obergruppenführer Otto Herzberg, who on the 6th of May died by suicide. There were also light and heavy anti-aircraft guns under Colonel Joachim Kortbach, an Air Force regiment composed of members of the Luftwaffe, mechanics, and former flight personnel under Lieutenant Colonel Achim Weil, with 4 to 6 battalions, and a combat group of the 269th Infantry Division under General Hans Wagner, units with Hitler Youth and the Fire Protection Police Regiment Breslau, that is, the Fire Brigade under Colonel, Chief of Fire Protection Police. Engineer Richard Grebo, the Anti-Tank Battalion Breslau under Reserve Lieutenant Leo Hartmann, here later in Bundeswehr uniform, with a few Jagdpanzer IV, Sturmgeschütz 3 and 4, Flakpanzers and self-propelled guns with Panzerschreck, and finally, an armored battalion with Panzer IV. The artillery had 32 batteries under Colonel Urbatis. The most important were 6 fortress batteries. Finally, the Breslau Engineer Regiment under Major Hamister with a larger number of radio-controlled demolition vehicles, the so-called Goliaths. In addition to the 2nd, which was flown in at the beginning of March, battalion of the 26th Parachute Regiment under Captain Hermann Trotz and under the command of Captain Skau, the units of the Paratrooper Regiment ZBV Schacht, named after its commander Major Gerhard Schacht, which was renamed Paratrooper Battalion 67 in Breslau, was the most combat-effective formation. The ad hoc SS Fortress Grenadier Regiment 1, consisting of many Dutch and French volunteers, with 4 battalions under SS Obersturmbannführer. Just like Lieutenant Colonel Georg Robert Besslein, who from early February until the surrender of the city was continuously engaged in heavy street and house-to-house fighting with the Soviet units, for which 4 of his soldiers were awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. On the night of January 30th to 31st, Breslau was shelled by Soviet artillery for the first time, resulting in many civilian casualties. After the ground war had thus become directly visible in the city, the pressure on the soldiers and able-bodied men in the city was also increased. I have already mentioned the daily order of the combat commander von Alphen from February 8th. So anyone who, as a soldier, no longer had a marching order now risked being sentenced to death and shot by a quickly convened court-martial. In this case, just like in Breslau, the Gauleiter as a political authority was also allowed to pass such sentences. The most prominent victim was Dr. Wolfgang Spielhagen, who had served as the 2nd mayor since 1941 and was a critic of the persistent, defiant Hanke. When, on January 20th, he had a travel permit from Ernst Lichtenstern, who was entrusted with running the affairs of the mayor of Breslau, he brought his wife and 2 children to what was believed to be the safe city of Berlin. After his return on the 26th, he was, by order of the person in charge, since the 30th. Hanke, who had been appointed SS Obergruppenführer on January 30th, 1944, on the 27th, arrested and on the 28th, shot in front of the town hall for extreme cowardice and for looking for a new position in Berlin, and his body was thrown into the Oder River. Without getting ahead of myself, while it is certain that Mayor Lichtenstern was, on the 2nd April 1945, lost his life in the fighting. The further fate of the bloodthirsty Gauleiter Hanke is not certain. Hanke, who was born in 1903 in Lauban, Silesia, had an affair in 1938 with the wife of the man who at that time was deeply in love with the Czech actress Lida Barova. Propaganda Minister Goebbels was on the 29th. On April 29th, after Hitler had accused the Reichsführer SS and Chief of German Police Himmler of treason, he was appointed as his successor. When Hanke's glory in Breslau came to an end, it is reported that on May 5th, he escaped to the west from the makeshift airstrip on Kaiserstrasse using the combat commander's Fieseler Storch. Then, about 120 kilometers away from Breslau, in the area of Lower Silesian Löwenberg, Polish Loek Szlaki, to the 18th Unit stationed there. He joined the SS Volunteer Panzer Grenadier Division Horst Wessel on the 8th. On June 8th, after being captured near Prague by Czech partisans, he was shot while trying to escape and then beaten to death. According to another version, he was taken to Poland and executed there. Back in February, the large Soviet units of the First Ukrainian Front assigned to Breslau were under Marshal of the Soviet Union Ivan Stepanovich Konev, specifically the 5th Guards Army under Colonel General Alexei Shadow, and the 6th Army under Lieutenant General Vladimir A. Glustowski. This army group was supported by strong air forces of the 2nd Air Army under Lieutenant General Stefan Krasowski. After the Soviet attacks launched since the beginning of February in the outskirts of Breslau had been repeatedly delayed, and in some cases even repelled by the German units. By the middle of the month, however, they had continued to advance, until they were only 10 kilometers from the city center, like here with their artillery near Hunsfeld. On February 15, Fortress Commander von Alphen issued another appeal to hold out. At night, Ju-52 or Heinkel HE-111 dropped ammunition and supplies, but they repeatedly had to overcome the strong Soviet anti-aircraft defenses, consisting of around 320 light and medium anti-aircraft guns, 150 anti-aircraft machine guns, and 80 searchlights. In total, Air Fleet 6, under the command as of the 24th, suffered losses. Field Marshal Ritter von Grimm, who took his own life by suicide on May 24, 1945, lost between October 15, February and April 25, 1945, lost 147 aircraft, and 61 more were damaged. After Breslau was finally encircled by the First Ukrainian Front on February 16th, the commander of the 6th UO Army, Lieutenant General Klustowski, sent Major General von Alphen a 24-hour ultimatum to surrender, which, however, remained unanswered. After which Breslau was now also attacked head-on between Neukirch and Brockau. To capture the heavily defended radio station, the Soviet company deployed there disguised themselves in German uniforms and posed as German soldiers. On February 27, the Breslau Front newspaper explained to the citizens how to use the Panzerfaust. If I were to describe the following days and weeks of increasingly bitter fighting now, the shelling with artillery and mortars of all calibers, the bombardments by the Red Air Force, the close combat with flamethrowers, bundle charges, hidden mines in the ruins, I still could not even begin to describe the mortal fear and agony suffered by the civilians living in the ruins, nor what the soldiers on both sides had to endure. While the Soviet soldiers had victory in sight, the Germans knew that the war had long since been lost. During the following weeks, one street after another fell victim to the fiercely fought battles. The number of dead and wounded soon reached the thousands on both sides. On March 7th, as I have already mentioned, Colonel General Schörner replaced Major General von Alphen as combat commander with Lieutenant General Hermann Niehoff, who immediately issued new orders to hold out. Under him, even partially successful counterattacks were now carried out. The two combat groups deployed to defend Gandau airfield were supported by the two paratrooper battalions, an anti-tank company, an 8.8 cm flak battery, and 20 aircraft cannons removed from damaged planes. During the Easter holidays of 1945, on the 1st and 2nd of April, thousands of phosphorus bombs dropped by the Red Air Force caused massive fires. In combination with a 90-minute artillery barrage, which marked the beginning of the second offensive against Breslau. In the south, the German positions could not be held and were overrun, after which the soldiers either had to surrender or retreat up to 3 kilometers. During the general assault on the city, the airfield was also lost, which made it impossible to fly in ammunition and supplies or to evacuate the wounded. From February 15th to May 1st, in May, the Luftwaffe brought about 1,500 tons of supplies into the city in over 2,000 missions. However, after the loss of Gandau and due to heavy defensive fire, supplies had to be dropped at night. Much of it also fell into areas captured by Soviet troops. As the fighting continued, with the completely exhausted and heavily depleted German combat groups being reorganized again and again, it became increasingly clear that the end of the fighting was near. On Sunday, April 20th, Hitler's birthday, Lieutenant General Niehoff had a declaration of loyalty published. By the end of April, parts of the Soviet Sixth Army were also worn out due to heavy losses. In addition, large parts of the First Ukrainian Front were fighting. Ukrainian Front were already fighting in the streets of Berlin. It was now only a matter of time before the Wehrmacht would surrender. After the Silesian daily newspaper reported Hitler's death on May 2, Combat Commander Niehoff promised in his daily order, "Trust me even in the darkest hour. You can be sure that I will lead you in a way that is best for you." Then the last days were marked by artillery fire and a propaganda offensive carried out by members of the National Committee for a Free Germany with leaflets and loudspeaker announcements. I made this video about the National Committee for a Free Germany. On May 6th, the German armed forces were also promised an honorable surrender during their capitulation, which, as in all other cases, was pure propaganda. Instead, as in other cities and villages conquered in the Eastern Territories, there were looting, arrests, deportations, mass rapes, and murders. After that, from the Polish side, came the general expulsion of 3.7 million Silesians. On May 4th, Hitler had already been dead for 4 days. General Niehoff met in his command post at the University Library with the Protestant president of Breslau, Ernst Hornig, and City Dean Dr. Joachim Conrad, and from the Catholic side, Auxiliary Bishop Joseph Fersche and Canon Joseph Kramer, who asked him to put an end to the suffering and to surrender. On the night of May 5th to the 6th, a sabotage unit of the National Committee for a Free Germany, consisting of 75 men made up of deserters and former German soldiers who had switched sides in captivity, entered the city. Led by former Lieutenant Horst Vieth, who had already deserted on the Eastern Front in 1941 from the rear, disguised as German soldiers to attack German units. Allegedly, this group was able to kill or capture several German soldiers, but also lost a number of its own members, including its leader, Vieth, to whom the city of Radebeul-Niederlöss has dedicated a street. Then, in the early morning of May 6th, the general of the infantry, Anander Niehoff, informed the population that he intended to offer surrender to the Soviet Sixth Army, After Niehoff's representative, Lieutenant Colonel of the Reserve Kurt Teisler, and Captain von Druck had held initial negotiations with Soviet officers, the surrender took place at the headquarters of the Soviet 22nd Corps at the Villa Colonia on Kaiser Friedrich Street, 14. After Niehoff signed the surrender papers at 6:20 p.m., officially ending the Battle of Breslau, the first Soviet units took possession of Breslau and inspected the spoils of war. Tens of thousands of German soldiers went into captivity, with an uncertain fate, from which many never returned. Out of the 30,000 buildings, 21,600 were destroyed or heavily damaged, as well as around 60% of the industry, 80% of the streetcar network, and the gas supply. There are a number of widely varying figures regarding the losses on both sides. According to estimates by the Polish-British historian Norman Davies, a total of 170,000 civilians were killed. While others speak of 20,000, the Red Army suffered losses of 13,000 dead, including 760 officers. On the side of the Wehrmacht, at least 6,200 soldiers were killed, many of whom rest at the German military cemetery Gross-Nedlitz, located 15 kilometers east of Breslau. Others still lie in the graves hastily dug within the city during the fighting, which have not yet been found. In 1963, the two generals von Alphen and Niehoff published the book So kämpfte Breslau together, in which they placed the blame for everything on others. Everyone should form their own opinion about that.